Welcome to our channel. Before we get started, please consider liking and subscribing so we can bring more stories like this to you. I've rented all kinds of places in my lifetime: dingy basement flats, questionable studios in college towns, and that one unfortunate year in an ancient farmhouse that had more mice than floorboards. So, when I finally found a cozy two-bedroom in a quiet suburb on the outskirts of Manchester, I thought my luck had changed. The price was reasonable, the commute wasn't too bad, and the landlord, Karen, yes, unfortunately her real name, seemed polite enough at first glance. That was before I discovered she was the type of landlord who believed that by renting her property, I was granting her unrestricted access to my life. I remember walking through the front door of the flat for the first time, noticing the new paint job in a calming dove grey. Karen proudly stated that she chose the color, insisting it projected an aura of peace. The living room had plush carpeting, a small fireplace, and windows that overlooked a tidy cul-de-sac. The bedrooms were modest but functional, and the kitchen, though a little outdated, seemed well kept. I was sold, especially since Karen offered a slightly lower deposit for tenants who agreed to a year-long contract. It seemed too good to pass up. Initially, the relationship was smooth. Karen would swing by once every few weeks, always with some plausible excuse: checking the boiler, making sure the gutters were clear, or testing the smoke detectors. Her visits never lasted more than 10 minutes, so I didn't think much of it. In fact, I kind of appreciated how involved she was. My previous landlord had been impossible to pin down for repairs or maintenance, so this felt like a breath of fresh air, at first. But after about 2 months, Karen's drop-ins became more frequent. She'd text me at odd hours, sometimes 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock at night, saying she just remembered to check the thermostat or that she was in the area. I work part-time from home, part-time in an office, so my schedule was flexible enough that I would often be in. She'd ring the doorbell and, before I even got out of my chair, I'd hear her jiggling the doorknob. That's the moment I started to grow uneasy. She always seemed to have the key in her hand, ready to let herself in if I took too long to answer. One particular Tuesday, I had planned to spend my lunch break in peace. Just me, my homemade sandwich, and my favorite afternoon TV game show. Right as I pressed the remote, the doorbell rang. Sure enough, Karen. She had an energy about her, the posture that screamed self-appointed authority, the clipped tone that suggested she wasn't merely asking to come in, she was telling. That day, she claimed she needed to document the condition of the window frames for her insurance. I must have looked skeptical, because she kept trying to justify the sudden inspection. She whipped out her phone and started taking pictures of the sills, the frames, even the corners near the ceiling. I tried to keep it cordial, but it was unnerving. I never actually saw any official insurance forms. She snapped her photos and left in a flurry of footsteps. At first, I didn't want to complain or create tension. The rent was affordable, and I'd been living paycheck to paycheck for years. But Karen's frequent drop-ins escalated to multiple times a week. Sometimes, she'd come while I was out, leaving small notes inside the flat: saw a smudge on the kitchen counter, please clean, or your living room blinds were angled incorrectly, not good for privacy. The fact she was letting herself in was a huge red flag. The turning point came when I found her rummaging through my hall closet, claiming she was looking for structural issues. My winter coat and shoes were haphazardly tossed around the foyer, which made it obvious she had gone deeper than just a glance. I decided it was time to set some boundaries. I sent her a politely worded text reminding her of the clause in the tenancy agreement about 24 hours notice for inspections or maintenance. She responded with a passive-aggressive paragraph about how true professionals never needed reminding to look after the property, insinuating that my concern about notice periods was a sign of tenant ingratitude. Those were her exact words. It was as though she believed any show of independence from me was a personal affront. After that text exchange, things shifted. Karen grew more cautious, but not in a good way. Instead of bounding up to the front door unannounced, she'd park her car at the far end of the cul-de-sac and watch my flat through binoculars. I wish I was joking. One day, my neighbor Liz, who occasionally walked her dog in the afternoons, tapped on my window to warn me that someone was lurking near the shrubs. It turned out to be Karen, crouching behind the hedge, presumably checking if I had guests over or something equally ludicrous. I called my sister to vent about the situation. She told me I had to document everything, every visit, text, and note left behind. You might need it if things go south, she warned. I remember laughing nervously, thinking, it can't get much worse than a landlord acting like a private investigator. But little did I know, it would escalate in ways I never imagined. And I'd be left wondering if I should have taken my sister's advice much earlier, before it all unraveled. A few weeks passed without any more surprise inspections, but Karen was far from idle. She started sending me links to cleaning 101 articles and proper rubbish disposal videos. I'd wake up to my phone buzzing with her messages, always telling me what time I should take the bin out or how to store leftovers properly. At first, I tried ignoring them. Then, I decided to respond with a simple thanks, I'll keep that in mind, hoping that politeness might de-escalate her. But of course, she took my compliance as an open invitation to intensify her micromanagement. Shortly after, I woke up one morning to find a typed letter slipped under my door. It had her name at the top, followed by a bulleted list of household standards. These were new, made-up rules that certainly weren't in the original tenancy agreement. My favorite, though, was no after-hours cooking that could produce pungent smells. Another highlight, all visitors must be pre-approved by the landlord. The kicker was a threat. Failure to comply will result in termination of the lease. I felt my jaw tighten as I read. It was a bizarre, controlling manifesto rather than anything resembling a formal notice. I called her out on it. I texted and said, quite plainly, none of these rules are in our signed contract. They violate tenant rights. She immediately shot back a message. Tenants have responsibilities, too. If you don't like it, move out. I realized that my approach of mild appeasement had only emboldened her. So, I took my sister's advice and started making a paper trail. I saved every text. I took photos of the letter, front and back. I even began jotting down a personal log of any odd incidents, just in case. One drizzly Sunday afternoon, I was startled awake from a nap by an angry pounding on the door. When I opened it, Karen was standing there, soaked to the bone, hair plastered to her forehead. She was outraged that my recycling bin was out on the curb a day earlier than the local collection schedule allowed. I tried to explain that I'd put it out because I'd be away the next morning for work, but she didn't care. She screamed at me that I was turning the neighborhood into a rubbish dump, and threatened to call the council if I didn't immediately drag the bin back onto the property. It was such a petty complaint, but her tone was frighteningly aggressive. The neighbors across the street peeked out from behind their curtains, probably half expecting me to call the police. I was definitely tempted. A week later, I walked into the flat after a day in the office and noticed a damp, musty smell. Tracing it to the corner of the bedroom, I discovered a growing patch of black mold. It was creeping along the skirting board, and the wall felt clammy to the touch. According to the tenancy agreement, Karen was responsible for structural issues, including mold caused by water seepage or poor insulation. So, I texted her, letting her know I'd discovered mold. She didn't respond. The next day, I tried calling, still no answer. Over the following 3 days, I left multiple voicemails. Finally, on the 4th day, she texted me back a single line, "Try opening a window." At that point, I was furious. This wasn't just about intrusiveness anymore, this was a health and safety issue. I told her, in writing, that if she didn't address the mold immediately, I would report her to the local housing authority. That got her attention. Within hours, she was at my door, yelling that I was threatening her. It wasn't an apology, nor did she offer to fix it. Instead, she insisted I must have caused the mold by cooking steamy meals and taking excessively long showers. She then stormed out, refusing to address how to remove the mold or prevent it from spreading. Frustrated, I decided to do some research. I learned that UK tenants have legal protections, and a landlord who neglects major issues like mold could be liable. Encouraged, I called the housing authority for advice. They told me that if the mold was indeed due to structural issues or inadequate ventilation, the landlord had a legal obligation to fix it. They recommended I notify her in writing via recorded delivery and give her a deadline to respond. So, that's exactly what I did. I felt uneasy about confronting her so officially, knowing her temper, but I couldn't let this slide. What I didn't expect was Karen's outrageous retaliation. About a week after I sent the letter, I received a formal eviction notice. She claimed I was endangering the property's integrity by persistently violating the lease terms. Every new complaint she listed was something trivial: bins, cooking smells, negative attitude toward landlord supervision. She had twisted the entire situation to make me seem like the problematic tenant. I was livid, but also anxious. This was my home, I had nowhere else lined up. And with the cost of living skyrocketing, finding another place with a similar rent would be a nightmare. It became clear that I was on a collision course with Karen, and neither of us was backing down. The next phase was bound to be messy. As I reread that eviction notice, I felt something stirring in me, not just anger, but resolve. If she wanted a fight, I would give her one. I was done tiptoeing around her demands. I knew I had rights, and I was prepared to defend them. Little did I know, the situation would escalate far beyond just eviction letters and phone calls. Police and the courts would soon be involved. I went through a wave of emotions after getting Karen's eviction notice: anger, fear, frustration, and then a sort of determined calm. I booked a consultation with a local solicitor who specialized in housing disputes. He was sympathetic to my predicament and found Karen's abrupt eviction notice suspicious. He explained that in the UK, landlords must follow a strict legal procedure for eviction, including valid reasons and proper notice periods. If Karen wasn't following those protocols, her notice could be challenged in court. Armed with this information, I sent Karen a firm but polite email, attaching excerpts from the relevant housing regulations. I stated that if she insisted on pushing for eviction without valid grounds, I was prepared to file a dispute. As expected, she shot back a barrage of texts accusing me of legal intimidation and harassment. I couldn't help but laugh at the irony. She was the one stalking me from behind the hedges, ignoring the mold issue, and inventing random rules. Nonetheless, the tension was tangible. I double-checked that my phone was logging every text. I had a feeling I would need all the evidence I could get. The following Sunday was my day off, and I was in the kitchen trying a new soup recipe, something comforting to stave off the stress. Suddenly, there was a thunderous banging at the door. I braced myself. Sure enough, there stood Karen. She had a smartphone in one hand, pointed squarely at my face. She started recording the moment I opened the door, spewing out accusations. I was willfully damaging the property by letting mold grow unchecked, I was violating her personal space by threatening a lawsuit, and I was a dangerous tenant who needed to be evicted for the safety of the neighborhood. I stayed calm and told her to leave, reminding her she hadn't provided notice for a visit. Instead, she shoved an envelope into my hand, another official-looking document. She claimed it was an updated eviction notice. I glanced at it and saw the same nonsense about failure to maintain a healthy living environment and repeatedly ignoring landlord instructions. She seemed to believe that repeating these accusations on paper made them true. As soon as I saw how hysterical she was, I stepped back into the flat and locked the door. She continued yelling through the mail slot, demanding I face the consequences. It was then I decided to dial 101, the non-emergency police line in the UK. I explained the situation, how she was on my property, refusing to leave, and was harassing me. The operator calmly took my information and told me a patrol car would swing by if she didn't leave. Eventually, Karen stormed off. But the next morning, I found an alarming note taped to my door: "Last warning before I take legal action against you." It was scribbled in thick black marker, underlined multiple times. It rattled me, I won't lie, but I also felt a strange sense of relief. She had played her hand too forcefully, and now I had a case for harassment. My solicitor agreed that her repeated, unannounced visits and threatening messages crossed the line. With his guidance, I decided to apply for an injunction to stop her from showing up without proper notice or valid reason. Filing for an injunction was nerve-wracking. I had never set foot in a courtroom. But the day came for the hearing, which took place in a small, plain chamber in the local county court. Karen arrived looking agitated, with a stack of papers she kept brandishing whenever the clerk or the judge spoke. She claimed these papers proved I was a negligent tenant, but most of them were just screenshots of my text messages, where I was politely requesting repairs, and half a dozen photos of the bin on the curb. It was almost comical. However, her expression made it clear she thought she had an ironclad argument. She was banking on a judge to see me as a troublemaker rather than a tenant standing up for myself. My solicitor presented the timeline of events: the mold issue, her refusal to address it, her harassment, her threatening notes, and the second eviction notice that didn't meet legal standards. The judge's eyes flicked over to Karen with a hint of skepticism. She tried to defend herself, claiming that she had every right to monitor her property. The judge reminded her that landlords do not have an unlimited right to enter or harass tenants. There are strict regulations about tenant privacy. Then, my solicitor unveiled screenshots of her texts, complete with her references to binocular surveillance. She had bragged in one of her messages about watching me from her car to confirm I was behaving. The judge's face was priceless, equal parts shock and thinly veiled disapproval. By the end of the hearing, the judge granted my request for an injunction. This meant Karen was legally barred from coming to the property unannounced or harassing me further. If she violated that, she could be held in contempt of court. After the judgment, Karen shot me a look of pure venom as we exited the courtroom. Then she marched off, barking at her own solicitor. The injunction was a major victory, but I didn't feel triumphant. The situation was still precarious. I still had this unresolved eviction notice looming, even if it was flawed. And Karen was obviously not the type to back down quietly. My solicitor warned me that I should brace for more drama, because people like Karen rarely give up without a fight. I was so drained. All I wanted was a quiet life in the flat that I was paying to rent, a fair deal for a fair price. But it seemed my life had become a twisted game of property chess, and Karen was determined to put me in checkmate. The weeks following the injunction felt eerily quiet. Karen went from daily text bombardments to radio silence. I began to think she might have finally realized she was out of her depth legally, or simply that pursuing me wasn't worth the trouble. I had scheduled contractors to fix the mold, with the cost to be reimbursed by Karen per the judge's direction. They came, they assessed the walls, and they confirmed the ventilation system was flawed. It took them a few days to rip out the affected plaster and install a simple fan in the bathroom that would reduce moisture buildup. A headache, yes, but at least it was progress. I found myself exhaling a little easier. The tension in my shoulders loosened. I dared to hope that maybe my confrontation with Karen in court had been the climax of the drama. Then, late one night, just when I was actually sleeping well for once, my phone buzzed. It was a neighbor's text: "Police outside your flat. Everything okay?" My heart lurched. I threw on my dressing gown, peeked through the curtains, and sure enough, a patrol car's blue lights were flickering in the street. I opened the door to find two officers standing there, looking uncertain. One asked if I was the tenant, and when I said yes, they informed me they'd received an emergency call from a concerned landlord claiming there was severe damage to the property. Karen had apparently told them water was flooding through the flat, that the building was in danger of collapse, and that I was refusing to leave. The officers were expecting a crisis zone, maybe knee-deep water. Instead, they found a perfectly dry, tidy flat, smelling faintly of fresh paint from the mold repair work. The officers were polite, but one of them pulled me aside and asked if there was a history of conflict. I explained, in the briefest possible terms, that I had an injunction against Karen due to harassment. The second officer's eyebrows shot up. He mentioned that Karen was outside in her car, waving for them to come over. The first officer told me to lock my door and wait inside while they spoke with her. I watched from the window as they went to Karen's car. She started pointing at my building, waving her arms, clearly ranting. After a few minutes, both officers stepped away, consulted each other, and then returned. They knocked again, apologized for the disturbance, and said there was no grounds for further action since no damage existed. They left, but Karen's car remained idling at the curb for a good 10 minutes before she finally sped off. That incident rattled me more than I cared to admit. The next morning, I updated my solicitor. He advised me to file a police report of my own, since Karen had used an emergency call in a malicious way, presumably to circumvent the injunction. So, I went down to the station. The desk officer took my statement and gave me a reference number. She also handed me a leaflet about restraining orders, something additional to the injunction that could potentially protect me from such malicious acts. I remember wondering if I had the stamina for yet another legal procedure, but the unpredictability of Karen's tactics convinced me I might need it. My intuition was right. Over the following days, Karen launched a sudden social media smear campaign. Though she didn't name me outright, she posted in local community groups that she was dealing with a destructive, irresponsible tenant who refused to pay for damages. She even posted a few photos of the moldy wall, pre-repairs, insinuating that I had destroyed her property. A friend of mine who frequented those groups showed me the posts, and I felt sick to my stomach reading the replies. People were rallying to Karen's side, calling for me to be thrown out on the street. There was no way to defend myself publicly without giving away personal information. My only solace was that Karen had not named me directly, so any defamation claim would be complicated. But it was deeply unsettling to see strangers lashing out, fully convinced I was some kind of reckless vandal. One evening, after a long chat with my sister, I came to a decision: enough was enough. This flat, despite its once appealing rent, was not worth my mental health. My sister offered me her spare room temporarily. I spoke to my solicitor about walking away from the lease, and he was sympathetic, though we'd invested so much in defending my rights. In the end, though, your home should be a sanctuary, not a battlefield. The legal victory was crucial for setting a boundary, but living under constant threat wasn't living at all. I gave the required notice, arranged a removal van, and moved my belongings out. Karen, ironically, tried to claim I owed her for breaking the contract early, but my solicitor handled that swiftly, citing her harassment and the improvements I'd paid for. She never returned my deposit, of course, but it was a price I was willing to pay to escape the chaos. The last I heard, Karen was still trying to rent the place out. The neighbor, Liz, texted me a few times to say prospective tenants arrived, only to leave soon after. Word must have gotten out, or maybe they could sense Karen's menacing presence. I no longer needed the final outcome of Karen's madness to define me. I found a small, honest rental through a friend's recommendation. It's not perfect, but it's peaceful, and that's more than I could ever say about living under Karen's thumb. Looking back, I still get chills remembering how quickly a friendly, involved landlord devolved into a controlling nightmare. If there's one piece of advice I'd give anyone renting a property, it's this: know your rights, stand firm, and document everything. The real Karen, it turns out, might not be a meme at all, but a very real person capable of turning your home into an emotional minefield if you're not prepared to fight back. And that, I can say with certainty, is an experience no one should ever have to endure.